Hi there and welcome to this video. I hope you're all well. I'm sure we've all done it. We get a new smartphone or a new camera and the first thing we do is change all the settings to the maximum. Well, why not? We've laid out a shed load of cash and we want the advertised performance. And then we're shocked. What do you mean I can't have everything on at once? What do you mean it gets hot? In my initial thoughts on my Nikon Z8 video, I expressed one of my concerns was around 8K video. And that's possibly because I'd fallen into that trap. So in this video, I'm going to try and shed some light on 8K video rather than just generate heat. So what I've done since that initial video is really spend a bit of time looking at 8K video. So let's start with that first question. Over the last 4 or 5 years as I've been producing content for this channel, I've always produced in 4K, even when in the early days 1080p was perhaps the norm. My view was that 4K was likely to become the norm over time and therefore it was about future-proofing my content. Over the 4 to 5 years, 4K has become the norm, so perhaps that was a good call at the time. However, when I look at 8K, we're probably not as close to that kind of tipping point. As a viewer, to be able to benefit or be able to use 8K, you need to be using either an 8K TV or an 8K monitor. Equally, when I look at my channel analytics, then the percentage of views on TVs, for example, has been pretty static at between 7 and 10% on average over the 5 years. Although with longer form videos, I am seeing 20+% of views being on TVs. So outputting so that you can see me in glorious 8K rather than glorious 4K is unlikely to enhance your viewing experience today, even if you're lucky enough to have an 8K TV or monitor. So if it's not about outputting content at 8K, then why record 8K? The other use for me as a creator is to try and create movement or interest in my videos, to try and make them more engaging for you as a viewer. So whether out and about or sat here capturing a talking heads video, a bigger 8K scene allows me to zoom, pan, jump to different cuts in post-processing. And that's without the need for multiple cameras and multiple takes. So it makes it easier to create more engaging content potentially. So what do we mean when we say 8K video? Well, obviously there's a number of dimensions and variables that we need to consider. There's the frame size. We need to consider the frames per second. Equally, we need to consider what codec are we going to use. Each of those codecs then has various quality attributes. All of this drives the bandwidth and therefore the card type you need, the file size and therefore the storage you need. And it also drives what can be done in post-production and the amount of skill and effort required. So I set myself the challenge, is it possible and desirable to use 8K video today? So let's start with that first part of the challenge, is it possible? Now, my concerns in my initial insights video into the Nikon Z8 were probably driven by that turn it all on and turn it all up to the max syndrome. I was trying to record NRAW 8K high quality video because that was the top end of the spec. Now interestingly, if you've watched my memory card video, you'll know that if you're recording at 60 frames per second, then the bandwidth requirements of that NRAW 8K high quality is about 723 megabytes per second. So you're recording just under 1 gigabyte per second. That's pretty meaty, and what I found was the camera recorded it okay, but my computer, when it came to post-processing, went into meltdown and started to work really slowly with those kind of videos, not unsurprisingly. What I've done is reviewed my needs for 8K, and where I've settled is actually H.26 codec, so far more manageable at all points in the end-to-end workflow. Because when we think about it, it's not just about the capturing in camera. There is the in-camera element of the workflow. We equally have the post-processing part of the workflow. So we have a pretty complex, multi-stage, end-to-end workflow to consider. So let's consider the in-camera elements of that end-to-end workflow. Here we need to think about things like file size and bandwidth, and we need to consider heat. When we're thinking about file size, then as you can see from the figures on the screen, there is an overhead in terms of file size for 8K versus 4K. The size of the file per minute of video recorded for 8K is just over twice that for 4K. Interestingly, for a comparison, I've put up there the file size for 8K NRAW. With regards to heat, there are two types of heat we need to think about. Card heat varies from card to card. Some cards are known to run hot and some cards are relatively cooler. I'm using the ProGrade Cobalt 165GB CF Express card, and I've run just a very quick test on that. And at an ambient temperature of 20 degrees C, I get a hot card warning with that card at about 20 minutes of recording H.265 8K video. But it carries on recording, and eventually at about 40 minutes I got a yellow camera warning. That's one before the red camera warning, and then the countdown to having to stop to let the camera cool down. Interestingly, when I tested my Kingston Canvas React SD card, I didn't get a hot card warning. I got a hot camera warning probably between 40 and 60 minutes into recording the video. Those were just quick tests. I'll do some more detailed tests. So the camera is good for recording 8K H.265 video. There's no problem there for me. So let's move on to the post-processing elements of that end-to-end life cycle. Now I use Adobe Premiere as my editor. And this is where the challenge came for me with raw 8K footage. So what I've done is with H.265, which are smaller file sizes, I have set Adobe Premiere that when you ingest it, it creates low quality H.264 proxies. Now this takes time because it does have to render all of the files, but without this step, the computer really struggled. Equally, even with proxies, I've reduced the playback resolution of the timeline from half, which I used for 4K, to a quarter, which I now use for 8K. And by making these adjustments, actually editing the timeline is silky smooth. It's all fine. So on to the next step, rendering the video for output in YouTube 4K format. As a rule of thumb, what I found was that if I had a timeline made up of 4K videos, it took about 1 minute for every 1 minute of video. So for a 20-minute video, it took about 20 minutes to render out. Now what I'm finding as a rule of thumb with 8K video in the timeline is that for a 20-minute output video, it's taking about 80 minutes to render it. So that's a 1:4 ratio rather than a 1:1 ratio. Now these are rules of thumb. Not all videos are the same. I haven't done a direct comparison, but what it does indicate is that there is a considerable overhead in using 8K versus 4K for me. So thinking about that end-to-end workflow, rendering is where the overhead of 8K versus 4K comes in. It's 4 times as long to render. And it's important to remember that I'm rendering my videos twice, once at ingest and then once in the final render out to the YouTube 4K format. So in summary, is it possible to use 8K today? Well, yes. Actually, the last 2 longer form videos that I've created, I've been creating using 8K input footage to see whether it's possible. So I've proved to myself it's possible to use 8K video, but is it desirable? Well, on the positives, hopefully it allows me to create a bit more movement in my videos, but there are some overheads. So can I mitigate some of those overheads? I've looked at alternative editors. These are possibilities, and therefore moving from Premiere to DaVinci Resolve perhaps, or Final Cut Pro is a possibility that I'll look at in a longer time frame. Thinking about storage, we become a little lazy in the digital world. We perhaps keep everything. I create about twice as much footage for each of these videos as I put into the final video, and I keep all of it. Increasingly, maybe I need to delete what I'm not using and only keep the footage that I'm actually using. So there are things that I can do to perhaps address the issues around storage and file size. Equally, I could mix the capture of 4K and 8K video for when I need it, so I don't capture everything on 8K. This would require more planning, perhaps more takes, perhaps a multi-camera approach, all things that are worth considering. So yes, there are things that I could do to mitigate some of those overheads to retain the positives that I talked about. So do the benefits outweigh the overheads for me? Well, at this point in time, yes, for some videos, perhaps my longer videos I'll record in 8K or perhaps a blend of 8K and 4K, and I'll look at some of those mitigations and how they might help. But for my shorter videos, such as 2-minute tips videos, I'll carry on recording them in 4K, and I'll probably continue shooting 4K when I'm traveling due to file size and some of the constraints that you have when you're traveling. So what have I learned? Well, I've managed to adjust and optimize my settings, in particular for video, to create an approach which I think is sustainable for me. It's possible, it's desirable, and it's now feasible and sustainable for me. So it'd be great to know in the comments below, how are you optimizing your video workflow? Equally, if you're not using video that much, how are you optimizing some of the additional functionality of cameras like the Z8 in relation to stills? Are you shooting faster frames per second? Does that impact your workflow? Do check out my video on card performance, which gives some additional insights in this space as well. And as always, it'd be great to see you on future videos.